Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here at the Perpich Center for Arts Education. My name is Michael Buck. I am one of the professional development specialists here. My area is actually music education, but I'm really happy to be here with a lot of my colleagues and introduce our guests as part of our Native Authors and Artists series. So first, to get us started, I'd like to tell you just a little bit, and I'm sure many of you are here because you are familiar with the work of Sam Zimmerman, but let me just share a little bit about his background and then we'll get into the interview. So first, Sam is a direct descendant of the Grand Portage band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. He is drawing on his ancestral connections. His art is in the Anishinaabe tradition, and it's in this tradition of storytelling with themes of environmental stewardship and conservation. His first book, which you see sitting up here, and many of you have in your hands, Following My Spirit Home, is a collection of paintings and stories from his first year back in Minnesota, having moved away and recently returned. So would you please give a warm welcome to Sam Zimmerman. So to get us started, tell us a little bit about your background, kind of growing up, your education experience, and where you spent some of your time in K-12 education just as a youngster.
All right, well, bonjour, miigwech, for having me. Sam Zimmerman, Disnakaz, Jean Migizik, Ojibwe, Bong, and Ajijak, and Dunam. I've shared with you my name, my clan, and my Ojibwe name. So it's kind of weird talking about myself, but prior to coming home and returning to Minnesota, I'd spent almost 20 years on the East Coast as an artist, an art therapist, a special education teacher, middle school principal, a superintendent, higher ed faculty, and as my dad likes to say, I punished the family by returning home. So this summer will be 6 years since I've moved home, and I continue to work in education as a working for the Minnesota Department of Education in the areas of academic standards. So if you don't like the standards, I apologize. And when I'm not doing that, I work as an illustrator, an artist, and an author, sharing Ojibwe stories.
How has your background in education kind of influenced your journey?
Well, I think being a middle school teacher and a secondary teacher in high school was I spent a great amount of time working with children who didn't know what they wanted to do, didn't know what high schools they were going to go to or colleges, and I would always be like, you can do whatever you want, you just got, this is the path, this is how you're going to achieve your goals. And after almost 20 years of having that conversation with kiddos and young adults, I realized that there was a huge absence from my life, and that was painting. I missed it. I hadn't touched a paintbrush for almost 20 years. And so as I approached another decade of life, it was time for me to kind of put my money where my mouth was with all those kids and come home and start to paint again. And so that's what I did.
Yeah, so that leads us kind of into our next question about the mediums that you work. Painting, you mentioned, is one. Well, yeah, what are the artistic expressions that you enjoy working with?
Well, I'm really impatient. I think a lot of educators can be impatient at times, but I do not enjoy oil paints. They take too long to dry, especially in the climate that we live in. And so I predominantly work in acrylic. When I first started doing children's books, I moved into watercolor. There's a certain kind of spirit to watercolor that doesn't exist in acrylic. The book that you were gifted to today when you were coming in the door is actually the first children's book that I've done in acrylic.
So where do you find inspiration for the work?
Well, originally, I would return to Minnesota as a child, to the North Shore, to Grand Portage, to my elders, and this was a completely different time when you're kind of just put outside and went to go explore with older cousins or other relatives, and you just hope that you make it to sundown still intact, running along the northern shore of Minnesota. And I fell in love with it as a child, the North Shore. There's no place quite like it in Minnesota. Not to say that Minnesota as a whole isn't beautiful, but there's something certainly unique to that environment and that geography and our relatives that inhabit that space. And what inspired me were the stories that I learned from the elders of growing up in a different time, and the culture and the values that were instilled. Our values are handed down orally, and even now, approaching my 5th decade, my dad shared a story with me a few weeks ago, and I was like, "How come you didn't tell me?" He goes, "I thought you knew," and I was like, "No, I didn't know this," and he's like, "You weren't ready to learn it," and I'm like, "Nice try." So the stories are inspired by paintings, and now being home full time, it's my experiences on the North Shore, or with elders or families or others that inspire my paintings. My experiences outside of the natural environment. You?
How about your work in public collections? Do you have work that's disseminated that way?
Yeah, I have done a number of murals. One that stands out is the mural in the Voyageur National Park. It was the first time that they had an indigenous artist working in that space. And the Voyageur National Park exists because of the land loss from the Anishinaabe and other indigenous people in that area. So it was really interesting to work in that space, in a public space, painting a mural, especially one that celebrates Ojibwe star teachings and our relatives. And so I'm currently actually the artist in residence at the Tedagooch State Park, one of 11 artists that are working across the state, immersed in the park, and so that's my next public space where I'm creating work. And so I'll be in Tedagooch through September of this year, creating public art, doing programming. We're actually going to have an art opening on Friday for the kids in Silver Bay who are creating work and having their first exhibition, bringing them into the park to create art alongside the space. So yeah, which.
How about telling us a little bit, and this might be a good time to segue into some of the slides. So some of the artwork that's in the book, Following My Spirit Home. Tell us a little bit about, some of these, the collection, it says it's a collection of paintings and stories, and they're absolutely stunning. I hope all of you have gotten a chance to look. If you haven't, you'll get an introduction here, but there's many more in the resource you have. So Sam was gracious enough to bring some samples for us, and maybe you'd like to start by talking about the one up on the screen right behind us now.
Sure. I love it with kids, talking about art with kids, because they have the best questions that you can expect. And
apologies.
It's fine, it's fun. But this picture behind me, Following My Spirit Home, this is the cover of the book. The book that you have is my latest children's book. But COVID scared me. It scared a lot of us. It scared me in the fact that if we lost elders, we would lose stories and we'd lose language. And so I spent 20, 21, and 22 working on this book. My father wrote the introduction to this book. He tried to offer editorial assistance, and that was shut down. He's actually, will remind me at the end, I'll share some secrets with you, but I got permission to share them with you. This is the cover of the book. I remember giving a book talk at a youngster, middle school age, of course, was like, "How long did it take you to do that painting?" And I was like, 42 years. And then he just looked at me and he was like, "What?" It was like 42 years. And then he looked around to his classmates to see what they were going to do, and the teacher looked at me. I was like, I was 42 years old when I did this painting. The age of my siblings, myself, and my parents are the total number of stars in this piece, including my 3 best friends that are represented in the pine tree that you will see in the crane. While I was away, even though my heart is in Minnesota and Grand Portage, it was my 3 best friends that sustained me for 20 years on the East Coast. And so those, why you see the crane carrying those 3 trees, the heart that you see up in the McGizzy, the hearts up in the Eagle, are my grandparents that I've since lost, and they've all journeyed home. And so it's their wisdom and their values that were instilled on me that I carry, much like the eagle carries wisdom and medicine with it. The bear is the Ojibwe Dudum clan, the Makwa, that speaks to providing and protection of the family, very much is one of the reasons why I returned home, was to come back to my family. And then you see the mom, the loon, they are a duo of leadership with the Ojibwe, the crane. They share leadership responsibilities, and so I often paint the crane and the loon together because they do in fact share leadership. And so this is why this was the cover of the book. So when I say it took me over 4 decades, this is my entire life in one image. So if you want, you can go ahead and move forward. This is one of my favorite pieces because this highlights a family story. Up in northern Minnesota, obviously the Ojibwe territory, the ancestral land, has been radically reduced. Grand Marais sits on original Ojibwe settlements where are now been reduced, but you can still see old settlement sites of where old homes were and whatnot in northern Grand Marais and along Highway 61. One summer, quite a long time ago, my dad took me to show me where my grandmother's rose bushes were that still grow. And they're growing through the cracks of the sidewalk on the northern side of Grand Marais, because that's where she would get her rose hips and she would make jelly. And she became a single parent. She lost her husband, he died very young, but she had 11 kids, the same number of trees that are inside the bear. And to honor her, I painted her rose bushes, but the one thing that was really kind of quite funny about this piece is as my dad was showing me where her roses could be found, he was also talking about where her garden beds were, and things like that, and he shared a story that my great-grandmother would give my grandfather and all of her kids birch baskets to go get berries so that she could make jellies and sell them along the road and trade. And my grandfather, being a young boy, didn't want to really, there's more exciting things to do on the North Shore of Minnesota than go worry about bugs and flies and bears and while you're getting berries. He would stuff the bottom of his basket with moss, so there was less to fill. And then he would return home and hand her back one basket that was obviously quite light, and she would never get upset. She would let him go play, and then she would respond the next day with 2 baskets. And that's the way he negotiated having to berry pick. He was one of the youngest children that she had. And you'll notice in my pieces, the moon shows up quite often. That's representative indicative to the grandmother. I've only met my paternal grandmother once or twice, but I hold her name. She was Josephine. I hold her middle name, so she quite often shows up in a lot of my paintings. You will see the moon as a way to honor her. And my dad likes to remind me quite often that I have her mouth when we get into arguments, so I really do respect her. Go ahead and move. So in the first one was my entire life, one was a family member, and sometimes somebody will share quite a fascinating story with me that really touches me and lingers. My friend up in northern Minnesota, north of Grand Marais on the way to Grand Portage is Hoagland. I mean, I think you can blink, it's about 4 miles long. And I always stop in to see her and chat and whatnot. And I pulled in and she was quite upset. I was like, I hope she's not upset because I just showed up unannounced. But she was telling me how she feeds the Wawaskaishi, the deer in the front yard, and this one buck is really aggressive, and she refuses to feed him, and she shames him and yells at him until he leaves the babies and the does alone. And she was so passionate about it, and she was showing me where she puts it out and where he walks to the tree line and how she stands there and stuff. And it just reminded me of the power of the female spirit. Myself, I'm two-spirited, and I remember growing up as a kid being told that I couldn't shaw dance because I wasn't a girl. And so every once in a while, the way that I honor myself being two-spirited and other two-spirited artists is that this character, her name is Nimi, it's Ojibwe for she dances, and so she shows up in my work, and my friend who's also two-spirited in this story, so I actually painted her dancing, and you can see the poor buck has been relegated to the back. And I called her on the way home, and I said, this story just won't leave me, can I paint it? And she was like, yeah, absolutely, you can paint it. She goes, make sure you put the buck, like, either like he's been injured, or I was like, okay, let's not take this as a dark turn. And so you can see the number of pine trees is 7 for the number of grandfather teachings of the Ojibwe, our values. And so thinking about how she respects her neighbors and how she honors them by feeding them. So this piece I did, and then I shared it with her, and I gave her a print of it to thank her for sharing that story with me. It was one of those stories that just sits with you, and by the time I got back home to my studio, I had to sketch it out, and so, yeah, good. Okay, if you are Indigenous, I'm sorry if I upset you in advance. I'll lend some knowledge. There are very strong feelings in Indigenous culture around owls, both pro and con. I think the collective strand is that they are messengers, they're very powerful spirits. I was raised by a grandfather who was, in fact, Ojibwe, and who raised his grandchildren and his children to respect them. There are those that believe that there is ill energy or negativity associated. I did not, with any animal, to respect them. And so in this piece, you'll see the owl holding both day and night, showing that tension of both positive and negative. There's a darkness and a lightness to all beings. And this piece is called A Tree of Life. I'm sharing this piece because this piece got me into a lot of trouble while I was working with Tom and Betsy Peacock of Black Bear Blueberry Publishing. They were the publishers of my book. They were gracious, and I wouldn't be here in this chair without them. I became an accidental author because I illustrated a number of books for the Red Lake Band of Ojibwe that were bilingual to preserve and hold on to language. And then just organically, as that relationship progressed, I shared that I wanted to do a book, and they were gracious enough to be my publisher and editor as we worked through this. That being said, when we got to this piece, and then the book is bilingual, when I was an art student, there was no Indigenous art on the slides. That's how old I am. When the professor would do the slides, we'd start from caveman all the way up to contemporary Europe and the Americas. There was no slides on Indigenous. I knew that George Morrison was from Grand Portage. He was celebrated. I knew that Norval Morrisseau and others were celebrated artists. But when I put this book together, this art book, I wanted to not only show a contemporary art book for younger Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Indigenous kiddos, but I also wanted to have the language, English, and Ojibwe moment. And so, because I was so worried with COVID. With this piece, it's titled Tree of Life, because my father's hands are actually traced underneath the water, holding both the loons up. And so if you were to stand in front of the painting, you could see the outline of the painting. You can't see it here because it's a scan. It's been photographed and slided, but if you were to stand in front of the actual painting, you could see my father's outline in the brush strokes, that he's holding both loons up. And so when I wrote the story, Tom and Betsy Peacock and others kept saying, well, Sam, this story doesn't match. There's no handprints in this image. I'm like, there are handprints in this image. No, we do not see hands. I'm like, I'm telling you right now, I painted it. This is my father's hands because he gave me life. This piece honors him. And they were like, no, there's not. And I'm like, and so this was the only painting in the book that required a phone call and a Zoom meeting so we could move to the next page. Because the original, you could actually see this very fine outline of his hands holding both loons. And this is the only piece that I've ever bought back from a collector. It was bought at a time when I wasn't really thinking. I had a show, I didn't mark it, not for sale, and about 2 years went by, and it just sat on my spirit that this piece had left me, and I worked with the gallery to contact the collector and have it returned to me. And so this piece is, like the cover of the book, is in my collection. And it'll stay with my family, or it'll go to Grand Portage when I take my own journey. I don't know what slide we're on.
We're on 4.
So
we got 2 more.
Okay, because there's a surprise, and I had to get approval, so. All right, next one. All right, to show you watercolor, this is an illustration of Nana Baju's hunting. This is from the book, How the Makwa Gets His Short Tail. It was the first children's book I did for the Red Lake Band of Ojibwe. It's actually quite a fun story. It was one of my favorite stories as a kid about the bear, the Makwa. It was really hard to paint a bear with a long tail. That's very odd. in this particular case, Nanabaju is out walking, and he sees how the bear is treating other animals and other relatives in the woods. And so this is one of my favorite pieces. The reason why I share this is Nanabaju, he's our human figure. He's very mystical. He's got a lot of non-human qualities. He helps to teach lessons and things. Tom and Betsy, when I did this first book, they called me and they're like, Sam, no one has eyes in this book. This is a children's book. You will scare kids. And I had to go back and redo the entire book and add the pupils and irises to all the figures. This is one of my favorite ones because the deer itself as well just had this glowing white, and they're like, parents will not be happy with us. And so this piece is actually one of my favorite illustrations. And so it shows Nanabaju out there with, he's hunted and he's going to have a conversation with the bear about manners. Then we're on the last slide. Okay, go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
So, as you can see, is there one more?
Nope, the surprise is after
That's
this.
the volume?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Miigwech. I'm working on the companion to the first book. And this is one of the images that will be in the new book. It is a celebration of the Boundary Waters. It is a celebration of those animals and relatives that reside in the Boundary Waters. And the number of stars equal the number of miles of portage through the Boundary Waters. I believe it's 1,007, but I'm a little fuzzy because I've only had one sip of coffee. But this piece is actually going into the second volume. It's coming out in fall of 26. I had to call the publisher to see if I could tell and share. She said I could, so that was awesome. And unlike the first book that is broken into different animals and different chapters by titles of animals, the next book is going to be done by seasons. And it's a curated book. And so it's those pieces that occurred or inspired by those seasons. The only thing that is going to be the same compared to the first book is there's going to be one chapter that's going to be titled To Tell a Story. And so it starts in spring. Trying to think because I was working on it last night. Yes, it starts in spring and ends in baboon in winter, because just like the Ojibwe, our lives start in spring and they end in winter. And so this is one of the pieces. So, Miigwech, thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, isn't that a great, and understanding the symbolism of all of that and all the things that are involved. There's so many details in there. Thank you for explaining those. So you mentioned some of the books you did. You also illustrated for other people. How about, that collaboration? Is that kind of the way you started, or, anything you'd like to share about that process?
Well, the book that you were gifted tonight is very special to me for a number of reasons. You'll see a lot of Zimmermans on that book jacket, because this was the first time. This is a children's book that was a story that was handed down from my great-grandmother, Josephine Trullard Zimmerman. Her family was from Bad River in Wisconsin. This was a story that she told my dad and my uncles when they were children. And my cousin Travis, his father is the oldest, my father is the youngest. He found this story written in graphite, and it was coming off the paper. It was written down 40-something plus years ago. And so he reached out to me and he says, I want to say one of great-grandma's stories. And this story was How the Birds Got Their Song. And so the book that you're holding is truly a way to honor not only her, but to also share English and Ojibwe language. It's the first book I did in acrylic. The cover is the only time my cousin and I got into a disagreement where I refused to take his call, because I am an artist and I am temperamental. The book was done, and I think artists, we have a certain kind of passion when we're like, this is great. I'm done, I'm excited, it's drying. What's the next thing I'm going to paint? And so this book was done on a number of panels, and it was done, I was really excited, I reached out to him, and the first piece that's always done for any book is the cover, so that it can get to the printers, they can start marketing it, and things like that. And so this cover was done. The thing I do not like about this cover, because all artists have something they don't like, is this cover, you'll see a number of trees. I believe you can only see maybe 8. Similar to the blueberry bear, or the rosebush bear, is that she had 11 kids. So 3 of them have been cropped off. That's fine, and I told my dad that. He goes, those are the uncles that I guarantee there's 3 kids she didn't like. And I'm like, all right. I was like, I don't know there, so I can't make that determination. And so the cover was done. I had to get it to the press, and I sent it to my cousin Travis. He is the director, he's the tribal, what is it? I forgot his title, but he's basically in Mille Lacs, at the museum of the Trading Post. And he comes back to me. Nice, nice. And I'm like, so proud of myself. It's my older cousin. He's like a big brother. Like, everything's gonna be great. He's like, and there was nothing, no other comment. Like the little 3 dots show up, and I'm like, I don't trust this. And a few days went by, and he got a hold of me. And he's like, our family's from Grand Portage, and there's no lake. I was like, excuse me? He's like, where's Michigan? Where's Lake Superior? I'm like, how dare you? And I was very upset. And he's like, you need to add the lake. I'm like, I'll do what I want. And I, of course, had some feelings and threw a little bit of a tantrum because I'm one of the youngest of the cousins of that generation. And then a few days went by, and I was like, all right, I'll paint it over. And so I added the lake to honor. The lake in the background in this book is actually in the harbor in Grand Portage. It's way out in the harbor. It's Pete's Island. And that was the only disagreement we had. And he still likes to make fun of me when we talk about the book, because he's like, was I right about the cover? I'm like, all right, calm down. You get one win.
So in the audience today, we have a lot of educators, especially librarians, so forth. So trying to bring this full circle to education, kind of where we started talking. Do you have advice for educators when they begin to explore the literature, the artwork of Native authors, and any cultural or aesthetic concepts or things that might help them approach this work, especially as they're just starting their journey to explore these works?
Well, I mean, I come from a place when I work on books where I want it to be exciting for kids. I want them to be engaged. It's very hard sometimes when kids are upper level, but they have lower reading levels to keep them engaged in select text. And I've spent enough hours on a reading rug, reading to kids over my career, where I want it to be exciting and visually pleasing, and I have them ask questions. I would offer this when educators are working in the area of Indigenous education or Indigenous topics, is to do research and to look at the books. Who's putting them out? Where are these books coming from? Are they coming from Indigenous publishers and printers? Are they Indigenous authors with Indigenous illustrators? I think that's something that's also what we see, is that we'll see Indigenous topics, but then we'll look at the authors and they're not Indigenous, but maybe the illustrator is, but really looking at the whole catalog, right? In this particular case, Travis and I are both, our fathers are both band members, we're direct descendants. This is a story that there are different variations of this story. This is just my grandmother's version of the story that was passed down. And the Minnesota Historical Society Press, that is the publisher of this, has been very thoughtful. Just like Tom and Betsy Peacock are both Indigenous publishers and authors, both in children's book as well as fiction, is really doing your research on the front end and looking at who's writing these books. There are a number of, I think about when I was a teacher to where I am now, almost 30 years later, is the amount of Indigenous authors and voices that are being represented. It was non-existent 20-some years ago when I started teaching, and there were the Mishuma's book and other books that were those foundation books that are still very important today, or the Four Hills of Life, or other, there were some critical texts that have stood for years, and now as more Indigenous voices are being reflected and represented, is being really thoughtful about the books that you're selecting. In this particular case, we're in winter, the Boone, which is our season of storytelling. So that's why I said yes to this, because it happened in winter and I could share stories. There are Nana Bijou stories that aren't to be told outside of winter, that's the only time that you hear them. You know, just like my father telling me a story a few weeks ago, and I was like, wait a minute, and he's like, you weren't ready. Stories are shared when the person is ready, you know, or they happen to be in the room. So yes, it's being recorded tonight, but you were here in person to hear my stories in person. It'll be shared, you know, because we have that technology and things like that. But traditionally, the stories were shared with those in the space, and they were gifted not only the time, but also the story as well. And that's what my intention was. And that's what my cousin's intention was in sharing the stories, to preserve the story in English, so it wasn't lost, but also to preserve it in Ojibwe Moan, which is a critically endangered language, to put that language to paper. And it was translated by a fluent Ojibwe speaker, and so that it is, you know, depending wherever you are, it can be read in its Ojibwe Moan correctly and appropriately. So,
Well, thank you for sharing all of this information. It's very enlightening to learn, and I really appreciate you being here today. Before we wrap things up, I want to ask you one more question, and then we'll move to the library for some signing and so forth, the books and so forth. But what brings you joy? I can say one thing that, you know, just sitting here and listening to your stories, it is really fascinating to learn the connections and the stories that you tell, and that every thing has so much meaning. So anything that you'd like to highlight about what brings you joy about your work?
Well, first I want to acknowledge my family brings me the greatest joy, and their patience with me. For those people that know me on a little bit more intimate basis, they know that I can be a little impatient. And so those that I have friendships with and family with, and their grace, and you know, the elders that teach me and those that share stories with me, I think is what gives me the people trust me. Gives me joy to be able to, the fact that you're all sitting here today gives me joy, because I'd rather just be drinking coffee in my studio, painting a pine marten. But I also have a responsibility to my father, to my mother, to my grandparents, my elders, that, you know, today I was in a conversation, someone's like, oh, you know, your work is so incredible. Like, it's all garbage. Because, you know, I experienced, you know, for a long time, I worked in education to lift children and their families up, and it took me a long time to put my own family in that same priority. And so they give me joy, and being home, being back near Grand Portage and the lake, and being in a space where I can help representation matters, you know, and that gives me joy that people want to talk to me, and want to talk to me about art, which is amazing, or talk to me about the animals that I'm hanging out with, you know. And so I just really honestly, just Chief Miigwech for being in this space with me tonight, it means quite a bit to me. So, thank you.
All right, well, just a couple of announcements before we wrap things up.
Does he want to give us your surprise now, Sam? Are we doing that? Are you ready for your surprise slide here? I still have one slide.
Oh, you still have one slide left that we could take a look at. The big surprise, the big reveal.
I was trying to forget about that slide. Okay, don't forget March 11th. Okay, we can do the last slide.
All right, here we go.
Here she is. It's like fireworks. This is the piece that I was writing about last night. She is titled Grand Marais Maangan, the Grand Marais Wolf. I was with another artist, Adam Swanson. He's known in the northern Arrowhead region. And this was the piece that I was writing about. And I was like, can I share this one? This is one of my favorites. The publisher was like, yeah, you can share it. We were coming down 61. I always love it when people say, I saw a wolf, and I'm like, no, you didn't, but sure. Because everyone thinks that coyotes are wolves, but they're not. If you see a wolf, you will know that you've seen a wolf because they are huge, and they are quite tall. And so we're coming back, we were doing a piece, an exhibition last fall on the dark sky, and celebrating the dark sky and the dark sanctuary of the Northland. And we were coming home, and you know, people who follow me on Instagram or things like that, they'll see my stories about what inspired me and things like that. And here's this other artist who I have a great rapport with, that I really enjoy. And this is the first time that another human was in the car other than like a family member when I've had an interaction with an animal. In this particular case, this wolf had come out in 61, stood on the median, and when they stand, you can't mistake them. When you see a wolf, you cannot mistake them for a dog, a coyote, or a fox. And she had come out, and their eyes are such a beautiful orange and gold at night. And she stood there, and she did not care that I was in a car on the highway. She was not going to move. I didn't know what to do. So I slowed down. She looked at me. Of course, I had my tobacco. My poor friend Adam was in the passenger side holding on to the thing. His snacks went flying. He was like, oh my God, am I going to witness it? I'm going to witness it. Oh my God, is this going to be a painting? Like, I'm like, just stay in the car. You know? So we did a U-turn. He's like, you're not getting out, are you? I'm like, no. It's a wolf. Like, even I have feelings about animals, but even I'm not going to get out and have a conversation. So I grabbed my tobacco, I put it down the window. I thanked her for giving us this visit and then she just looked at us and walked up the shoulder of the road. And so we're about an hour and change from Duluth. Everything that we were talking about, like our next show, work, his kids, my cats, I have a problem with cats, now became about this painting. Like, what are you going to do? When's it going to be done? Oh my God. And so, sure enough, this piece is such an incredible piece because this was the first time that it wasn't a family member, it was a buddy. And there is power when the Mayans show up. They are the first teachers of the Ojibwe. They helped us with our language and gave us the language. And so this piece was painted with toothpicks and safety pins, one dot at a time, because as my grandfather would try to teach us to bead, I'd rather be outside throwing rocks. And so part of my style of painting honors my grandfather, who didn't know how to bead, and so I honor that practice by painting in this style. So there's the sneak peek for the very first piece of the winter chapter in the new book.
All right, so just a couple of announcements and we'll move down to the library. First of all, on March 11th, we have another in the series from the Native authors and illustrators, and we will feature another guest artist. And I had it pulled up on my phone, but I lost it. And see, this is the problem with technology here. Anyway, help me with the name. Our guest artist is going to be?
Wendy?
Kim Signifus.
Kim's Signifus.
Signifus.
Yes, thank you very much. That's March 11th. That's our next event. So thank you very much to all of you for being here. But how about we're gonna we'll help you you kind of find your way if you don't know. The library is just down the hall. But I'd just like to say another thank you for just some really fascinating stories and some amazing artwork. Can we thank Sam for being here?